So with that, I'd like to introduce up the next panel, if you'd like to come up and take a seat. This is going to be one of those panels where we're missing a speaker because he is in Corpus Christi and unable to get here for road closures. I'll give them just a moment. Okay. Great. So with that, we are going to continue with kind of this reflection on some of the very pressing issues in groundwater discussion right now. And one of those that came to us was a discussion on the value of groundwater. And so I'm very pleased to introduce to you Director Peter Lake from the Texas Water Development Board, who will be the moderator for our next panel discussion on the value of groundwater. Let's welcome him up tonight.
Thank you, Sarah. Yes. I think that's working fine. Unfortunately, we are missing one panelist today due to the obvious circumstances on the coast, but we will sally forth with Charles and Amy. Like Sarah said, my name is Peter Lake from the Texas Water Development Board, and we're going to be discussing market or valuation of groundwater. Before we get started, would you guys be kind enough to give us a quick introduction and background?
Sure. I'm Charles Porter. Most of y'all know me. I've spoken many times at TAG, so I won't go much into it. I teach at St. Edward's. I teach water policy. I speak about water a lot around the state, written books about it from history on up. I recently got my Ph.D., which y'all may have remembered, and I wrote another book called Public Water Policies, The Ultimate Weapons of Social Control. I've now recently, in the last year, some of you have heard me speak about it. Ed McCarthy and I wrote a journal article, which I presented at UT Law School Institutes, called, about challenges in the credible valuation of water.
I don't know if this, now it's working. Okay. My name is Amy Hardberger. I'm a law professor at St. Mary's University School of Law. I do focus primarily on water law, although I also teach land use, good old first-year property law, and environmental law. I'm also a hydrogeologist before my lawyer days, so sometimes I wear two different hats, and I recently have focused quite a bit on, I sort of came up that I have to say that whole panel was sort of the all-star team, the one right before us, and many of those people have been my mentors since I came into the world of water and water policy, and so my sort of conservation aspects of it have moved in the direction of land use and valuation. And so that's sort of where I live a lot, particularly municipal pricing and price structures for utility sort of protection and long-term sustainability.
Good deal, thank you. The notion of valuing water came up a couple times in the previous panel, and of course, we value all sorts of things in Texas and America today. In many ways, water is like lots of other commodities, but in other ways, it's completely different. It's a finite supply with varying demand, and we, of course, don't know when we're going to have weather contribute to that supply of water. So looking at the economic value of water, Amy, what kind of legal underpinnings do we have in Texas?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the things that I love that this panel followed the one before, because we, of course, the capture question was a great one at the end, and everybody in this room is pretty familiar with what the legal structure is for groundwater, and so one of the overlaps or relationships that I think is very interesting and is a challenge, but also an opportunity, is that because we have limited sort of regulatory authority, shall we say, that one of the opportunities that we have in terms of both moving water that was discussed in the last panel, but also valuing water in place, all sort of moves itself towards markets. And so I will say personally, just as a side, I was not horribly comfortable in sort of my early days really thinking about water markets and sales. I sort of had a knee-jerk reaction against that. But if we are going to move in that direction and it is a tool that's available to us, then we need to make sure that we're addressing what the market should be and shouldn't be. And so to answer the question, because groundwater in particular is in fact a private property right, it actually opens itself to a greater possibility of a market system. That being said, valuation and other aspects of it need to be ensured so that it's not, just that our ultimate goal isn't to sort of we can meet the ultimate outcome. And so when you look at other similar systems, like oil and gas is the one that always comes up, the outcome goal is quite different. It's for everything to sort of be pulled out. That's when it has its highest value, is out of the ground. But when we talk about groundwater, we have to add in these valuation mechanisms and consider what is the value of having sustainable groundwater in place, both for this moment, for springs, but also for future generations. And so that legal construct both is a gift in terms of having it as a defined property right, because once you know that you have a bundle of sticks, you can start talking about what it is that you want to do with them. But it's also a challenge because your neighbor also has the exact same bundle of sticks, often with the exact same molecule of water. So, for groundwater specifically, the legal underpinning is you own your groundwater. How do we apply that to a market? That's a much larger conversation.
Well, when you get to markets in terms of valuing water, the property markets obviously are tied closely. Charles, what do the property markets tell us about how we might value groundwater?
Well, it's really simple, and you've heard me talk about this before. Water renders the land its value. And so land with water is worth more than land without. And I think when you fully answer this question where it says, what does the market tell us? Well, there's a market for property, we know that, and then as Amy talked about, there's the bundle of sticks that make up property rights. I think the water right and the water availability is the key bundle in that middle that sets the bundle of sticks up. Other people can argue about that. But we don't have an open market for groundwater in Texas. In fact, we have very few open markets for water at all. You heard Carlos mention we don't want to, we so far have been reluctant, at least the people have, to transfer water across the state. And when you get down and think about what would be, again, I'll go in my professor mode a little bit, but, what's how do you fairly market, how do you value groundwater? And I'll get into some details in a minute, but the first thing is how you define what fair market value is. Our water code has a simple, what we all know. Two parties, willing buyer and willing seller, who are in our water code, it says not under compulsion to buy or sell. It's a little more complicated than that because the simple version other way says duress. But you can look at Texas water and you can say we're always under duress, right? Our norm is drought. So what is the fair market value of water? And you look at some longer definitions that some folks at SMU use that I very much respect, and that's where you've got a buyer and seller that act prudently and knowledgeably. To have an open market, you've got to have a buyer understand what he's buying and a seller understand what he's selling. But I may know how much groundwater is underneath I may know that I have groundwater underneath my ranch in Wilson County, which I do. I know that I own it. But what am I going to use it for? Okay, the use is really important. And if I want to sell it somewhere, if I can't transfer that to the end user, what's it worth to me? In other words, in real estate, time is of the essence in a real estate transaction, right? Well, time is especially of the essence in a water transaction. If I don't have, there's not the political will, no matter what the law says, that I could sell my water from my ranch in Wilson County to San Antonio because I can't get a permit in a timely manner, that has a big impact on value. Overall, though, to get into big detail, think about it. Our most cherished social values in Texas are funded by ad valorem taxes. Okay? That's based upon land value. Again, land with water is worth more than land without. And what about some of the rural-urban wars, so to speak, not declared war, but if San Antonio reaches out and takes the water from Castroville, what happens to the land values in Castroville? How do we make those kind of decisions? And we can talk more in detail about that, but there's no doubt that the market's got to determine how we're going to use the water, which also determines the price. And we've got to make a decision as a population how we want that to go.
You mentioned the use of the water as it's associated with the value of that land and the value of that groundwater. How much do you imagine the value of the groundwater would vary based on how you're using it?
Tremendously. If you read that article that we wrote, You look at it in four different normal ways, replacement costs, and it's hard to kind of figure that out, but I did an analysis of an irrigation well and what it cost. But you look at the net operating income for the uses. If I can't transfer my water, say, like the friends of mine, and I don't want to get in the Wimberley deal, but the friends of mine, there were ranchers that owned their water and wanted to sell it to electrical purification or lease it and sell it to Buda. If I can't transfer it to Buda because I don't have the right-of-way or I can't get a permit in a timely manner that I can't finance, then all my value of the water is what I can use it on my property. I have a model that's based that you all can see. What I use my water for would be, let's say I grow corn. Well, I can figure out at $4 a bushel how much water it's going to take for me to irrigate my crop, assuming I have no other water, and come to a number of anywhere from $600 to $700 an acre foot, right? That can be proven. You can argue it all different ways. Then, of course, is it really worth $5,500 an acre foot? Well, it might be if I have that use on my property, but if I can't take it and send it from, say, East Texas down to San Antonio because I can't get the right-of-way, because I can't sell it to the end user, then what's it really worth? And so the use is really, really important. Somebody said to me a long time ago in one of my presentations, well, Charles, you're overlooking the fact that you could do a water bottling plant. You could, but you got to spend $2 billion to do that. So you look at the whole prospect of that. Hope that kind of answers.
Oh, absolutely.
Can I just add something to that? So I do think that we have limitations on a statewide market, as Charles was mentioning, mostly because there's the permitting issue, but also there's the physicality of movement. But I do think that we have a really interesting example of an active and effective water market in the Edwards. And so, and part of that is the uniqueness of the geology of that you can have a transfer of ownership without actually needing a pipeline, because of the karst feature of that. You can actually have someone, for the most part, purchase in another area. Basically, they're just buying the paper permit and pulling it out where they are, and because that water moves around, you can do that. So obviously that isn't necessarily possible in every aquifer or groundwater district in Texas. That being said, I think there's some really interesting points that can be taken from, in addition to the geology of the area, what really makes it possible is the fact that there is a pumping limit. And so for a group of groundwater districts, I think what is really germane to this conversation in terms of what is your potential role in future groundwater markets, it's the fact that you're the permitting authorities. And the Edwards would never be able to work if you didn't have a limited system. So when I teach this to my students, I think I always use the example of a game of musical chairs. As we pull the chairs away, the existing chairs, the remaining chairs, increase in value. And so if we had an entire, if all y'all left and I was playing musical chairs in this room, that would be a pretty lame game because there's plenty of chairs to sit down in. And so the interesting sort of paradox I think that comes in here is people wanted groundwater, a lot of groups wanted groundwater ownership. They want their water to be valued. They want it to be a commodity, either for them to add value to their property and place or to be able to sell. But the only way that that's going to be possible is with some sort of limit, permitting authority, and knowledge of how much water is there. Otherwise, your analogy of how much your water is worth for corn, the one thing that doesn't take into consideration is your neighbor could pump you dry, in which case, in many areas, certainly areas that don't have groundwater districts. And so your assumptions, what I'm seeing there are a couple of groups that are working on land valuation that includes the water. Well, they're double billing because they're giving me my valuation with my water, and you might be my neighbor, and they're giving you your valuation water, and they're not taking into consideration that I can remove all your water, in which case I'm sort of emptying that out. So if we're really, the valuation of your property. So if we're really talking about wanting to incorporate that into the price of property, if you're really talking about moving towards taxation and really being able to capitalize on that, there has to be some regulation in place so that we know for a fact which water is mine, and that means that there has to be some accountability between users, which our current policy doesn't really have built in.
And that's exactly right, because if you're, I have a special certification to do valuations in real estate, and I can't assume that water is going to be there, and so that's why these valuations are so difficult to make that are credible. Because Amy could I could have a permit, she could have a permit, she gets it before I do, and I'm out of luck, right? Mm-hmm. So that makes these valuations very different than say, valuing this building here that doesn't move, you know?
Yeah, and the other thing, too, that I would say is that one of the tricks to groundwater is we're not the only people playing in this field, right? The landowners are not the only ones that matter. The existing landowners who want to pump right now or want that permit are not the only players in the field. There is a valuation. There is a value, that ecosystems valuation piece. There is a value to having groundwater in place right now, particularly if there's a spring flow connection. There is a value to having water managed in a way that 3 generations from now there will be water. And current market systems and what we're seeing rolling out in the places where we do have groundwater transfer projects going into places, we are not taking any of that into consideration. We're not internalizing any of the costs of massive dewatering into the price of that water. So when you see these price tags, which are pretty staggering, Vista Ridge, which many of you might be familiar with, is, you know, in the 3 billions. Even with that, we're not really thinking about what happens if we are dewatering that aquifer in such a way that hydrologically it can't recharge again. That cost isn't being incorporated at all. The lawsuits will pay for that later on if that in fact happens.
And she's right. I could agree also in the fact, another thing to add to that is when we say, do a permit, we don't figure out a way in Texas, and it's very complicated. How do you deal with the conjunctive relationship between groundwater and surface water? If the groundwater goes away and we use the normal process, we want to go through a permit and better use, what happens to the surface water? How does that relate to the environment later on? How does that work to downstream folks? You know, what happens in Lake Buchanan if the groundwater districts have every right and the owners up there pull enough water out of the groundwater, it affects the surface flow in the Colorado River. We don't really know there's no really regulation about that yet. We're trying to think about it. Senator Perry wanted us to think about that, but nothing's come because it's tremendously complicated.
You talked about a pretty, I don't want to say clear and direct, because I don't want to make it sound too simple, but your example of a bushel of corn at X dollars per acre seems to get you at least on a path where you can have a buyer and seller agree on a price. But how do you come up with the price for that ecosystem value, those spring flows? That seems like a much more challenging exercise.
Oh yeah, no,
than that.
it is. I mean, it definitely is. And I would say the 2 issues that I have with talking about water in terms of buying seller and buying willing buyer, willing seller, setting the price are 2 things. One is we are not, you know, I think it was Carlos that said, or maybe it was Andy that said, you know, we have got to shift from a reactionary water planning community to a proactive water planning community. And allowing markets just kind of go unfettered and say, well, these 2 people agree to this number, let's all just, you know, let that go by, is that is setting us up for more reactivity. And so there's 2 major things that aren't included in that. One is the ecosystems valuation is not included. We're not really calculating. And I think, by the way, DFCs, this is where DFCs become really critical because they really are supposed to be the thing that's building that into the market through building in a limit or scarcity. And I don't want to say scarcity, but a non-unlimited permitted amount. And so if I think that you can, from an existing policy standpoint, you can build in some of the valuation of that long-term sort of sustainability through the DFCs in areas where we have groundwater districts. Now, of course, we can just go bananas on talking about what happens if the county right next door doesn't have a groundwater district and it's a free-for-all. The second thing that I would say generally about pricing water that is very, very difficult is the traditional supply-demand curve uses price as a signal to let people know the value of something, right? And it's actually meant to reflect societal values, and it's meant to move whatever that good is to its highest value use. Well, the problem with that is that you're not going to get a price signal of the valuation of scarcity until it's actually scarce. And by that point, you're now sending a price signal that's too late. And this is where the water market really moves away from the market for widgets, because and I am not an economist, and I've tried to, play one on TV, and sometimes it goes woefully wrong. So if you're an economist, just, plug your ears or something. I don't know. But basically, there's a couple of things that make markets functional, non-water markets. One is the substitutability of goods. So if Iowa is we're going to talk a lot about corn today. If Iowa's growing corn and Indiana's growing corn and Indiana has a hailstorm and there's a scarcity, the price will go up, but at the end of the day, we move corn from somewhere else. And so when it comes to water, that's just not an option, partially because we don't have the infrastructure and we have a limit. I mean, we can't just keep figuring out other places to get it from and moving it around. That's the reality. And even if you could, I think at some point the price has a diminishing return. And the second thing is the movability. So back to the corn issue, even if we can find corn, we can move it, we can't always do that. So when you have this sort of market with holes in it, is how I like to think of the water market, and a different goal, when it comes to water, we don't want the market to just tell us what that willing buyer and willing seller think about that water right this second. We want to know what that means for both of them 5 years, 10 years down the road, or what that means for their grandchildren. And so that's really, to me, the biggest missing piece in the water market is any information in that price about the true value. And I think I've never heard anybody disagree with me. If somebody wants to disagree with, they can raise their hand. But almost anybody that's in the water world right now very clearly feels that water is underpriced in comparison to its value to us. And that includes municipal water pricing. And certainly, a lot of people are getting water completely for free.
If you somehow move towards a price for water that is more truly reflective of its value, does that in some ways actually make it easier to move? That we can move oil and gas, or barrels of oil, do it all the time, because you still have a lot of value at the end of the road to whoever you're selling it to.
Right.
Would the same thing happen in the water ecosystem, you think?
Well, I think you get two parts of that, and I don't know, you may want to chime in on which way you think it's going to happen. I mean, one of the tricks to water is at some point, and this is my old writing, and I won't go too far afield on this, but my old writing was all about the human right to water and how we have to, water is different than oil and gas. And so even if what you're saying is true, and I do think from a market perspective there is some truth to that, is if you drive the price up enough, you motivate people to go get more of it. Fracking is kind of a perfect example. Once the price of the barrel went down, everyone's kind of like, oh, we'll take a break. The problem I think that you have is that who is your buyer going to be at some point? And so when you're out costing the people who are going to be receiving this, and I think that there is an ethical component to this of, is there a point in which water is too expensive? Is there a protective layer that needs to be built into that market that you wouldn't see in a normal market? I mean, if you can't afford a Rolex, nobody feels that bad about that, right? Like, nobody's crying that I can't, go out and buy a fancy car. I just don't live in that echelon. That's my choice. That's a harder argument to make about water. It's not a luxury good, it's a requirement. So that adds a sort of a whole other wrinkle into it.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that's exactly right, and she alluded to, demand. Demand's got two elements, not only a need or a want, basically a want, but you also have to have the ability to pay for it. And so, we may have other demands elsewhere for water. Robert Lee, Texas probably needs water. Are the people there willing to pay, to pay for the water transfer someplace else? And I think all that has to play into it. And we've got to make a bigger decision as a society. How do we deal with the urban-rural interests? If I'm on the city council of San Antonio, I'm going to look for a duty to bring water to my city. But what does it do to those areas around the city? Where are they going to get it? How does that work? One last thing I'll say back to her comment about Edwards Aqua Authority, I agree completely there. In that regard, when valuing it, it's a similar type water in really the only open market here. You can compare those transactions, but you can't compare a transaction at Edwards Aqua Authority with a transaction out, say, in the Presidio area. It's very different. That much makes these valuations so difficult, and then it's impossible almost at this point, I can figure, yet how some way to convince a jury about this environmental value. I mean, how do you come to that? But once it's all gone, then it can really be seen.
Yeah, one thing I want to say too, just as a clarifying, is that and I think that the conversation often goes in this direction, that when we talk about water markets and water valuation, we sort of automatically shift into this idea of one area of Texas buying it and moving it to another area. And I do think that there are a lot of complexities with that. But I do want to introduce the notion of the power of markets in a much more sort of subtle and regional way that is very effective and actually goes back to the previous panel on conservation. Because when you have a water right in Texas, and this is somewhat a surface water right situation, You get that based on whatever irrigation techniques you were using in the past. I think this goes to Charles's point of that how you're using it sort of automatically comes into the conversation. But when you have a property right, there is no policy ability to go to somebody and say, hey, that way that we think you're using water doesn't make sense for that area of Texas, or it doesn't make sense with modern new irrigation techniques. And the reality is we don't have a political hammer to make them shift. We do have a market hammer or a market opportunity or a tool. And so we see this with paying for people for drier options where cities, and by the way, this is one of the huge opportunities between municipal and rural areas, which is instead of making it a tug of war, let's have the market assist us in this transfer so that somebody is rewarded. Why don't we think about ways to incentivize people financially to put in more efficient irrigation systems, thus using less water, and then whoever else needs it, let's say there's no more permits available, that person can actually, buy that. And so these are transfers, very regional specific transfers that are opportunities that could happen. The problem right now that I think we have is connecting these people. But I don't think that the only opportunity for water valuation and water markets is large-scale water transfers. I mean, that has a lot of complications built in, and I think there's a lot of other opportunities where valuation and willing buyer and willing seller can really have a power and an efficacy that right now policymakers just can't because they don't have the tools.
And let's expand it a little bit too. It's not just me selling to Amy, Amy selling to me. It's also in that longer-term contract, whether it's regional or across the state, there's a financing component to that because it's so expensive. That financing component is going to ask a question, will the water be there for the time it takes to amortize my loan? Will the permit last long enough for me to amortize the loan? There's another whole element there, and that's that financing element that will act almost as if it's so to speak, maybe a control factor. The other thing when you think about farming, how do people hold on to their land now? It's not very seldom it's with farming. A young person can't go out and buy a $200,000 John Deere tractor and all the implements and owe money on his land and make money from corn or soybeans or anything else. So that also is making a difference in these uses. And it's down to, you talk to the ranchers in West Texas. They'll show you a beautiful in South Texas, Santa Gertrudis cow. And they'll love that cow, think it's beautiful. But what keeps the ranch is that little quail wandering around that they pay $10,000, $15,000 a year to hunt.
From that perspective, Amy, you mentioned the power of markets, but in a lot of ways, markets also act can be a ruthless allocator of goods. And the scenario you were laying out, Charles, I mean, do we really want that true value of water applied to people in that ruthless market?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say personally, no. I mean, I would not, I'm not advocating for sort of a full, whoever can come and bring in the biggest dollar can take the water. I mean, I think that where I see markets coming in is as an additional tool to what we already have. And so, and let's face it, the markets are here. So the question really isn't should we introduce markets, it's how do we adjust markets to make sure that they're working for our ultimate goals. And in this group, a lot of, for those of you that are spending your days in groundwater districts, I would say your goal is to have the sustainability in your aquifer and meet your DFCs. And so to the extent that you feel hindered or trapped by the law in terms of what you can and can't permit, there may be opportunities for right now people who are identified as winners and losers turning into winners and winners through markets as an additional tool to that. So certainly there are people that argue, turn it over to the markets, it'll sort itself out. I mean, everybody knows a market swings in one direction and it swings back. The problem is when you're out of water, you're out of water. And none of us really have the capacity to sit around for 200 years and wait for some of these aquifers to recharge. So to sort of do that as a free-for-all, I think, is a foolish endeavor.
And I don't think Texans trust an open market system totally and put 100% trust in it. We have a conservation amendment in 1917, which, in my opinion, you've heard me say this before, it's not a choice for the legislature to conserve our natural resources. It's a duty for them to conserve it. And the judges, not fussing at judges, and the legislators, remember the legislators have got to have the courage to say, here's what we need to do to protect all Texans. We don't need to be Travis County Texans and Smith County, Texas, we need to be Texans. Somebody's got to get up there and say what's the best for all the people of Texas, and that involves not having a completely open, free market where it's just whoever has the most money wins, and the whims of that marketplace. We've made decisions. One thing I've said for a long time is we also need to put some money into how we figure out how much really water is there. How do you allocate something fairly if you don't really know how much is there? And groundwater is tremendously complicated to do that. You don't want our juries to make decisions when you've got 5 eminent hydrologists up here, all experts, testifying on different value and different amounts of water. How does a jury of our peers make that decision? I want to see a lot more money go into the science so we can go back, get away from the assumptions and the models. And that's hard to get people to understand how important that is. But I know we can do it now. I think we've got the technology.
You both seem to be arguing for some sort of legal or policy framework to capture the benefits of market forces, but at the same time provide some protections to our citizens. What does that look like? I mean, what's the first? I mean, it's obviously tremendously complicated, but what's the first step in what that looks like?
So I think sometimes it's not what you would originally guess. So, I just taught water law this morning, and one of the things that we were talking about is, water law, we all know, is a property rights class. It is not an environmental class. It is not a sustainability class. It is about property rights. And whenever we talk about property rights, the first thing you have to do is define the right, whether it be a water right or anything else. And so really, the one thing that I think that we're still really lacking is a true defining of what your right is. And so, we saw a bill that the governor didn't sign that talked about, brackish water. And that was not a valuation bill, but it absolutely would have been a piece of a valuation puzzle, because if it defined who could regulate it and how much it's available for users, and if that water is below your surface, then that plays into your valuation of that water. So a lot of it really is continuing to understand what the property right is and what it isn't, and that really is steeped in understanding what the limitations of the regulation are. And I'll go back to the Edwards sort of example, that the uniqueness of that, in addition to the geology, is the fact that we have a known quantity, we have the science, we have a very good understanding of that geologic system. We have a maximum amount of pumping. We have set cutback limits and triggers when there's a drought, and we have connections to the amount of water that you get in association with your surface right. And what we've seen is that those property rights, the original Edwards permits were given away, right? If you could show that you had a historic right, they were given away. The value of those rights now in certain areas are through the roof. So that market is working, and the value of people who had land and have water rights, their value continues to increase the longer they own that land and the more that sort of scarcity in the surrounding regions happens. So I would say if you want to first figure out how to best manage your market, you have to define what the right is. And so that way, if you don't know what you have, you can't effectively transfer it or keep it or value it.
And the Edwards is, again, a prime example. For a market platform to work, you've got to have the parties on buyer and seller side understand what they've got to sell and what they're buying first. They've got to have some predictability. They've got to, think about your houses. Well, the MLS system has set a market platform that works. You don't have to find a situation. If I have to go out and pay $50,000 to attorneys and hydrologists and everybody else that I might need to determine what I've even got to sell, then that limits that marketplace, right? And the same thing goes on the purchasing end. How do I know what I'm buying if there's not a general knowledge out there? The Edwards Aquifer Authority and that system. I've helped some people transfer water between cousins and aunts and uncles and things when somebody dies. It works. You can know where you're going. You know what you've got. You know how much you're selling. That's got to be done elsewhere, or there's no hope for that marketplace. I think we're on the same page on that.
Yeah, and I'd say the other policy piece that gets built into it is, do you have a permit? Is that permit a 30-year permit or a 50-year permit? Is it subject to cutbacks? All of that is part of defining the right. There's actually a water marketing group that's done some really interesting work in Nebraska in specific groundwater districts, and what they do is they actually have an algorithm that builds in the policy management. So it builds in that somebody's right might be stronger or higher value because it's not subject to cutbacks, or it's subject to less cutbacks, or they have a longer permit threshold. And so when that person goes to put that on the market for that small marketplace, it gets valued in a way that reflects all the policy limitations or lack thereof that particular water right has. And so even though there are parts of Texas that would be obviously very different than the Edwards, there are opportunities and examples of other types of things that have made adjustments based on local conditions. I do think, again, not to be a dead horse, that when you have groundwater districts in one area and then you have areas of the aquifer that are not managed, that starts to get very, very difficult, I think. No algorithm can figure that out.
Well, and the other thing too, and I've got a new article about the history of the Groundwater Conservation Act that'll be published in the Panhandle Plains Review here in a couple of months. But, bottom line, it's difficult when you've got 100 groundwater districts that have 100 different ways they even define domestic and livestock use in a lot of ways. If you go to my own journal called TexasWaterPolicy.org, I've had a student of mine, a Fulbright intern, a year ago, go out and just let's list how each groundwater district defines domestic and livestock use. It's amazing. It's somewhat different. If you're in the Austin area of our MLS area, you've got 12 different groundwater districts with 12 different sets of rules. I'm not saying that's wrong, because I think you can't have things managed in our geographical difference the same way, and the rules have to be different, but it's awful confusing to people out there that in the marketplace. It makes it very difficult. What if my ranch sits in a larger place and I'm in 3 different groundwater districts? How do I figure that out? It's hard.
Would improving these or establishing more clear terms and definitions also help solve the problem you mentioned of what happens when you lose access to groundwater? Is that something for a jury to come up with? What's a way to improve that?
That's a whopper. So I would say it depends. There's a law answer for you. I think that more important than definitions, although I do think definitions are really important, is probably consistency in permitting across places so that it's an apples to apples comparison, like a 20-year permit or transfer permits. I think that one of the challenges, one of the sort of the great things about groundwater districts is it really allows people this regional approach. I think one of the hard things is it does allow for a lot of variability. And so the one opportunity for more consistency and maybe one of the opportunities for sort of managing the market better is actually at the GMA level, where the DFCs are sort of set, and then you can have some individuality with groundwater districts, but the goal and I think that which could probably get me in trouble, but that's why Sarah put me up here, that there should be a little bit more coordination, because I think this is the ongoing challenge of between groundwater districts and a certain GMA, how much are they really coordinating with their permitting to make sure that DFC is met? I think if that can happen, then sort of that more aquifer-specific management and market could be open to be more successful, and you can get away from some of the minor differences in definitional aspects.
Amy touched on something, managing to the aquifer instead of along county lines. That's not what she said about county, but Darrell Peckham, who most of us know, talked about managing the aquifer. But how do we do it in the structures we have now that's fair? And to me, I think the groundwater conservation districts should reflect the will of the local people that are there. But how many of your local people in your districts really do participate? How many, when you have a groundwater district meeting, how many people show up other than the people that are looking for the permit? That's where Amy and I have got to educate these young people coming through St. Edwards and other schools and law schools. Think about what water really is. Think about that and understand our system as it is in water governance and policy and participate in it. If not, y'all can't do your job and feel comfortable with it, and the state can't do its job.
Got a couple questions from the audience here.
That's a big stack, y'all. Makes me a little nervous.
Did Guitar versus Hudspeth help or hurt water markets? And that was what made historic use permits non-transferable.
That's a good question. I guess it sort of depends on what your goal is. I mean, one of the things that I think is helpful from that perspective is that it opened up the opportunity for people to, not have an unbalanced value based on their prior use. So I do think that there's, in terms of sort of opening it up to not really setting winners and losers in place and giving people sort of this opportunity, I think that it opened up. I think that actually was helpful. And the way that I read it, I mean, I'd have to probably think more about that very specific question, but the way my interpretation of it and thought on it is it doesn't really keep certain things from happening. I mean, I think some of the markets, and by the way, one market, as I see Karen sitting over there, one market that I didn't mention is we send price signals all the time in municipal areas as well through water pricing. And so tiered water pricing, we didn't even get into the municipal price structure, but that is, in fact, in my opinion, a water market because you're using prices to let people know the value of water and trying to manage their behavior. So I just want to sort of throw that out. But so while I think that case might have altered certain types of water markets, I think overall it's probably not creating the majority of the problem. I think the property right issue is the big one, the larger property right issue.
I agree with everything. I think GTAR is a tremendously complicated case, and its consequences are complicated. I'd love to hear a panel all day with Russ Johnson and others that participate in it to talk about it and see the consequences now, because I don't have factual data about it.
Sure.
Okay. I'm kind of an odd duck. I've got graduate degrees in both mineral economics and hydrogeology. And over the years, I've delved into the matter of groundwater economics. In fact, 20 years ago, I set up the model that guided SAW's acquisition of water rights in Bexar, Medina, and Uvalde counties. Now, what I realized over time is that there's probably no commodity that's more misunderstood, the economic value of which is more misunderstood than water. And when you get down to talking about water markets in Texas, you have to look at, there's no one market, there are markets. And my approach to this was something I learned many years ago from an old professor, Marian Radetsky, and Walter Labies, who wrote about what they call market structure, bargaining power, and resource price formation. In order to understand where the price of a commodity comes from, you have to start off understanding your market structure. And the market structures across Texas for water, groundwater in particular, are highly variable. And if you walk into a negotiation thinking that you're looking at the same kind of market structure in, say, West Texas that you see in East Texas or Central Texas, you're going to be steamrolled. Now, bargaining power is what each party brings to the table with respect to information and what he or she or what that party, the buyer or the seller, is willing or able to offer, and how that person can use, that party can use his relative bargaining power to his advantage. All right, now what I hear in Texas, what I've heard in Texas so many times is that, well, we think that our water is worth this here because Dallas paid that much for water over there, 500 miles away. Now you can't do that. I've even seen another consultant in Texas refer to the value of a water right in Colorado as a basis for arguing that water should be valued a certain way in Texas. You can't do that. You can't do that. So my point simply is this. You cannot just barge into something and assume that you have an efficiently functioning market or that there is one market. It's very complicated. And there are a lot of variables in this. If you look at the value of the value of water, that's an equation with 9 or 10 unknowns, 9 or 10 variables. And, well, so I'm curious. I mean, what is your perspective on this? To me, it's a lot more complicated than I think I hear from you. And when you're dealing with water, you're dealing with a commodity that's not like something like gold or coal. So what's your perspective on this?
I think I've said, I've maybe not made it clear enough, I think it's tremendously complicated.
Yeah, I think we said complicated.
I think it's impossible to make it credible. I mean, it's so hard to find a comparable, just like you said, how those markets work in different districts, how it works across, there's no one market. And I don't think there's going to be one market. I think they're all going to be very, very different. I couldn't agree. Everything you just said in a statement, I agree with you.
Yeah, and I would say actually I don't think there should be one market, and I don't think either of us have ever advocated for that, because I do think that well, first of all, you have this history of water being managed in a regional way, and I think there is a reason for that. I mean, and we see that even nationally, right? That water is a states' rights issue. There's a reason for that. We've gone one step further in the regionalization of it. So, and I think that for me personally, that's where I start to have concerns when we talk about these water grids being built across the entire state of Texas and moving things around, because I actually think that negates the regionality of it, and I think that actually creates more sort of where the water just flows where all the people are, and that actually has massive economic negative repercussions to Texas. It can't just go, I mean, obviously where people are, we need water, but it can't just be a sort of a turnkey thing. So I think that's reflective in the comments that we've made sort of throughout the session.
Another question that might time nicely with closing thoughts. What specific single policy change is needed to develop a market where all uses and non-uses are appropriately valued?
Can you just put me in charge? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, sure.
Do what Amy says. I don't know. Can you go first so I can think about it?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any one policy can do that. I don't think so. I think it comes back down. This regional aspect's going to always be different. When you've got, like one of our speakers said, you've got 60 inches of rain. I think Andy said 60 inches of rain in East Texas and 12 inches of rain in West Texas. That's why our groundwater conservation districts locally work. There's no one solution to it. I do think, though, that a solution that could help is for us to better understand how our system that we have works, the DFCs. Yeah. You know, how do we figure this eventual, the feds may make us, you know, they have supra-legal authority over us in so many ways. They may make us understand better this conjunctive relationship between groundwater and surface water. And maybe that's the right thing to do. I mean, I want my grandkids and my great-grandkids, who I'll never know, I want them to have a place to live here. And maybe we all determine as a people that let's have a lot more open land and do nothing with it and just enjoy it, you know? It's kind of nice.
Yeah, I guess I have sort of two. One is that I would just sort of harken back to this notion that we have to continue to define what the property right in water, in particular groundwater, is and what it isn't. And I think that, you know, with the Day decision and the limitations in the law on the legislature undoing a property right that's been designated by a court, we're a little bit strapped in that one. But I think that and a lot of people have talked about this, the next step is really understanding what your property right is in relation to your neighbor. Because when it comes to valuation, when you have something that is missive, that can travel between the two of us, we need to understand, we both can't be claiming 100% value for each one of those things, because that will lead to inaccuracies and massive sort of overpumping. So that's my first one, is that we've really got to continue to understand what is in our bundle of sticks. The second thing is, I don't think that Texas has really effectively defined what our outcome, our desired outcome, I don't want to use the word desired because of desired future conditions, but what is our goal when it comes to water? Now that seems like something we've done, but I would challenge people to really be able to give me the elevator speech on what that is. And I would be even more specific in that and say, I'm not sure I'm 100% clear on what the goal is for groundwater districts in terms of an aquifer. Are they supposed to be representing the aquifer? Are they supposed to be representing the maintenance of that on behalf of Texas, like we do with surface water? Is it to issue permits for everybody that has a surface estate for anybody, or specifically the people who live within the boundaries of that groundwater district? I would proffer that until we have a valid understanding of what our outcome is, there is no way we can possibly get there. And we as a community need to be leading that discussion and not letting that be told to us or avoided by the legislature because it's too sticky. Like Charles, my goal is for water to be here in the future for all uses. As Karen mentioned, that can be quite challenging because if you're against Little League or if you're against lawns like me, I'm going to be put into, I'm fine with Little League, just so don't come after me, but I will stand up to my hatred of lawns in semi-arid and arid areas. But so there needs to be this hard discussion, and we've touched on this several times, that there's this prioritization. We all assume that there's a prioritization, but we've never really done it. We've never really had that conversation for groundwater, and I would say that part of the prioritization should be protection of groundwater, protection of open spaces for all of us on longevity. And so if I could have a policy magic wand, I would say, what's the plan? What is the plan for Texas groundwater generally? I think the structure that we have, going back to what you're saying, the structure that we have with GMAs and the planning process is incredibly unique. I don't think it's being used nearly as effectively to get us to an outcomes conversation and decision as it could be.
And part of the way we judge that outcome is through our court system, right? But we can't have a situation in Texas in these critical issues where we have the normal drought conditions when it takes 16 to 20 years for a major case to get to the Supreme Court and decide it. We don't have that much time anymore. I mean, I've started to work with a group that, Bragg took, 20 years. Day took 20 years. Other cases take years and years. One of the things I've talked with a group of attorneys about, we're beginning to try to figure out a way, does Texas need a special water court? Do we need some way to process these cases more quickly? I don't blame a judge that's elected to how they're concerned about which way they rule on a case because they're going to go up for election again. I mean, maybe we need a separate water court. That's part of that education thing because the court system has to kind of figure out how all these policies fit with the Constitution, in my thought.
Interesting. I think that,
We've got it all figured out.
yeah, we'll get on that magic wand for you, Amy.
I need one for so many things.
Well, sure appreciate the time and insight. Thank you for the questions. Thanks, sir.